Good morning, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and a good night. I am King Piggly. This is Gaming Imperfectly, and welcome back to the channel, guys. But if you're new to the channel, I am King Piggly, and I hope you like what you see, because we started doing something different on Gaming Imperfectly. And you guys know I do all kinds of things. Like, I do little skits. I've done a Star Wars skit. You know, I do all kinds of little things, and I like mixing it up. But here lately, I've really been getting into telling stories, and you guys seem to be enjoying it. So we're just going to tell a great, scary, spooky story for the season. And also, I want to wish everybody a happy Halloween, because this is the last video I'm going to do with the 31 Days of Horror. So this should be out and around Halloween and whatnot. So happy Halloween to you all that celebrated, or Samhain, or whatever, All Hallows Eve, whatever you guys want to call it. But get ready for some spooky stories, guys, because I'm going to do two today, actually. I'm going to give you guys a special treat. The first story comes out of Georgia, here in the United States, okay? And it's about this kid who's a 14-year-old kid. This happened in the early 2000s. So, of course, he's not 14 anymore, but this kid named Eben Clark was 14 at the time, and him and his dad, James Clark, lived in a little town called Tallulah Falls, Georgia. And Tallulah Falls is in northern Georgia. It's kind of like in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, and the town itself is like 170 people. There's really nothing there. You know, a small community, tight-knit, and everything else. Well, James Clark, Eben's dad, was actually a contractor. He did all kinds of work like that, and he also did surveying. And it turned out that there was a very wealthy man in the area that came in and bought some property, and he wanted to maybe subdivide it and do some stuff like that. So Eben's dad, James, got to know the guy, and, you know, after a while, they kind of struck up a friendship, and so he told James that he actually owned some property nearby that was gated, and that it was up for use, like hunting and whatnot. And it turns out that James and Eben both were avid deer hunters. They loved being out in the woods. They loved hiking. They loved all things outdoors, guys. And so, you know, James was really grateful to this guy and was like, "You don't mind?" And the guy's like, "Not at all. You know, you and your son go hunting there. Help yourselves," you know, and he gave him the code, because remember, it's a security thing. It's a gated piece of property, and it had to be like 80 acres or something like that. And so, you know, James goes home, tells his son Eben's like, "Get your camping gear, get your rifle, son. We are going hunting this weekend. Get everything ready." Eben was so excited, and the day came. Friday, they drove out early morning on a Friday. They got to the gated community pre-dawn. I mean, the sun was probably 5 o'clock in the morning. They put the code in, the gates open, in they drove, they shut the gate, they made sure it was locked and secured, and then they drove in as far as they could drive. Now, the road ends to a certain distance into this thing. It turns into a dirt road. It's probably like 2 miles into this, you know, a mile into this gated hunting area. This private land. And so Eben and his dad get out of their truck, they lock it, you know, they get all their camping gear, and then they hike into the woods. And once they get into the woods, one of the things that struck them both is that it was just still, quiet. There wasn't any wind, there wasn't any crickets chirping, frogs doing their thing. I mean, this is early morning, right before the sun came up. And it's starting to get lighter and lighter, but there's no sound. And you know, if you have any experience in the woods, guys, this isn't uncommon. Because, you know, once a human walks into the woods, all the animals there, squirrels and whatnot, they got to go on high alert. And everything just kind of either moves away or quiets down and just wait. And that's a part of being out in nature. You know, you learn to kind of get that feel of what's around you. So they didn't think anything of it, but they just noticed that it was very still. It was very quiet. So they came to a clearing, and they were looking around, and they kind of knelt down in the clearing for a little bit. They decided not to just immediately go and set up their gear, their tent and stuff, you know. They decided to kind of scan this clearing, because in the early morning, a lot of time, deer and whatnot will walk out into clearings to eat. And, you know, you see their silhouettes. Even in pre-dawn, you can see their silhouettes, and you get a feel for what animals are in the area. But they didn't see any animals, and again, they didn't think anything of it. They're like, well, let's go set up our tent, you know, this way. You know, they walked through the woods a ways, and they were going to come back to this clearing later. And they wanted to put some distance between where they were going to be camping and having a fire and making all the noise that you make at a campsite away from where they were going to be hunting. Until they came actually to another clearing. And they were like, well, this seems to be a good spot to set up our tent. So they set up their tent in this spot, and it was one of those dome tents, and it actually has the fiberglass rods that cross over one another and bend down, and then you connect them to the tent itself. It's got these little metal posts that stick up, and you connect it. It's like a little pop tent. And so they set their tent up, and they set up a fire circle, with stone, so they could have a fire and whatnot. But by this time, it was maybe, 12 o'clock in the afternoon by the time they got all their gear set up and whatnot. So the dad says to Evan, he says, hey, you want to go look for more animals? Let's go scout the area, see if we can find a good place. They had brought their own blind with them. And for you guys that don't hunt, a blind's kind of like a camouflage thing that you can set up in a tree line or even out in the open if you want, that kind of fools animals into thinking that you're not in there. It's like a little shelter that you can hide in, and then bang! But they brought their own blind, so they were going to go scout and see where they could set up this blind and whatnot. But after a while, they decided to set up their blind in this tree line on the clearing that they had originally gone into. And they set their blind up, and they waited, and they never did see anything. So come that evening, Evan's getting hungry, and he says, Dad, can we go back to the campsite? I'm ready to call it for the night. We can get up early in the morning and come back out and go hunting. And so his dad was like, sure, no problem, Evan. So him and his dad walked back to their campsite. And when they came into the clearing where their campsite was, where their tent was set up, as soon as they saw it, they knew something wasn't right, because their tent was collapsed, like completely collapsed. And they were like, well, that's weird, and they walk up to it, and upon inspecting their tent, all the posts that, the fiberglass rods that bend into the post, or that you bend and put into the post, because it's held up by tension, guys. This is a tension tent. It gets held up by tension on these fiberglass rods. But it had been taken out. Like, the tent was totally collapsed. And, the dad was like, oh, Evan, you must have not set this up right. And he's like, Dad, we set this tent up quite a bit. I know what I'm doing, kind of thing. Evan was kind of irritated with his dad for even accusing him, like teenagers do. It's like, Dad, I didn't mess up, So he was like, okay, well, whatever, son. He's like, here it is. And Evan's like, well, maybe there's somebody else out here. And he was like, no, I talked to the owner of the property before we came out to make sure that, for safety purposes, because if you're hunting, you're shooting, you want to know if there's other people around. And he asked the guy that owned the property, the dad did, James, asked if there were going to be other people out there. And the owner of the property assured James that it was just going to be him and his son out there, and that there was nobody else in this place. Now, again, there is a fence going around this land, guys. There is a gate that has to have a combination code to get in, and there is actually barbed wire on top of the fence that surrounds this property. So it's not easily accessible. Plus, there is actually a camera at the gate to see who comes in and out. So, this is private hunting land. So, Evan's dad was like, no, we're the only ones out here. You must have not set it up right. It's the only thing he could come up to. So they went to bed. They started a fire, and they had some dinner, and they sat around the fire talking for a little while. But, any of you guys that do spend time in the outdoors, you know how it works. After a while, the sun goes down. It's not like you're sitting in your house watching TV till, 1 o'clock in the morning. You get tired. The sun goes down, and your body almost acclimates to being in nature. And so they went to bed. Like, it's not long after dark. They stoked the fire a little bit, and they decided, well, you know what, we'll just go to sleep. So they did. They laid down, and they went to sleep. Not long after being, Evan's asleep, Dad's asleep, Evan wakes up probably a few hours after falling asleep. And at first he didn't hear anything. He doesn't know why he woke up. But he looks over, and his dad's still snoozing beside him. And he's like, and he kind of rolls over to go back to sleep. And then he hears this sound. And at first he couldn't quite make it out, because it seemed like it was pretty far off in the distance, maybe 700 meters. But then he all of a sudden hears it distinctly, and it's laughing. He hears someone laughing. And he's like, but then it stops. And he's like, no, I'm imagining things. There's nobody out here laughing. And Dad already told me there's nobody away. There's nobody out here. And he waits, though. He listens really intently. And then it strikes him again how quiet it is. There's no sounds. No birds chirping, no bugs cricketing, no nothing. No frogs, nothing. It is dead quiet. And he swore he heard laughing, but he doesn't hear it again. So Evan kind of rolls over and goes back to sleep. He doesn't know how long he's asleep, but all of a sudden, he feels, somebody grab him and shake him, and he kind of looks over, and his dad's there, and his dad's like, shh, and he's pointing outside the tent, kind of, like that. And then Eben kind of sits up and's like, and, looking at his dad like, what? And his dad's like, be quiet, and listen. And all of a sudden, he hears it, and it's laughing. 100% certain this time. And his dad's eyes are wide. And his dad grabs the rifle, and it sounds like this laughing now is even closer. And it's one of these maniacal laughs, guys. This isn't like, I'm a friendly, hey, this is a funny joke kind of laugh. This is blood-curdling, hairs pop up on your arm, goose pimply, scary laughing. And so Eben's terrified at this point in time. And he can see the fear on his father's face too, because they know that they are the only people that are supposed to be out there. But this is distinct laughter, and it's closer than it was before when Eben thought he heard it, So he's sitting there and he's listening, and they're both listening, and the laughter quits and goes quiet, And then it's quiet for just a short period of time, but then it starts laughing. Whatever it is starts laughing, this maniacal laughter again. And it's closer, and now it's actually on the other side from where they heard it before. So it was over here, but now it's over there. And they're like, what? And it's closer. And it seems to be maybe 300 meters away, which isn't very far, guys. In the middle of the night and pitch black, because the fire had gone out, it's not a good situation. So Eben's dad's like, okay, this isn't cool. So he's got his rifle. He tells Eben to get your weapon, get your rifle. He's sitting there, and they're on edge, and the dad's kind of debating whether or not he should go outside to investigate, when all of a sudden they hear this maniacal laughter while still laughing, running towards their campsite. You can hear it through the woods. The woods are so quiet that it's clear that whatever it is charging towards their tent with speed. And suddenly, as soon as it sounds like this, whoever or whatever it is laughing, gets right outside of their the clearing that they're in the tree line. It stops running, and it's just standing in the tree line laughing maniacally. So Eben's dad's like, okay, this isn't cool. So he goes and he grabs the zipper, and he's going to go out there. He's armed. He's like, I'm going out. I'm going to go see what this is. He tells his son, you stay here. And he grabs the zipper, and he starts to unzip the tent. And as soon as he starts to unzip it, the sound of the tent must have alerted whatever this thing was, whatever it was, whoever it was, that they had obviously disturbed the people sleeping, and it went dead silent. So Eben's dad freezes, because now, there was almost it's weird, when you hear something like that, at least you know where it's at, but once the noise stops, now you kind of left to interpretation of where it went. Is it still standing there? What's going on? That kind of thing. You just don't know. So they sit, and the dad's holding the thing, the zipper, and he's like, okay, man, should I go out there? Should I not go out there? What's going on? That kind of thing. And ultimately, he decided not to leave the tent. And him and Eben sat in that tent till sunup. Never heard the laughing again, and they never heard whatever it was that came running forward retreat. But the next morning, as soon as the sun was up, they packed up all their stuff. They went and jumped right back in their truck, and they got the hell out of there. So the dad calls the owner of the property and was like, explain to him what was going on, and says, hey man, somebody was out there doing this. And he says, James, that is impossible. It's a gated, you were the only people in there. You're the only guys that I gave the code to, and I know for a fact nobody else came, because I looked at the camera and I've looked at the footage. And I don't know what to tell you, but you were the only people on this property at the time. Spooky. Who knows, guys? If you think you have an idea of what was going on, love to hear it. Put it in the comment section. Now, for the next spooky story. And this one is a doozy. Alright guys, so I hope you're ready for this next one, because I know that last story, the guy laughing out in the woods, put my hair on end. Boy, it freaked me out. It makes me think twice about going camping. But this one's happened in a town, In fact, it happened in Reno, Nevada. And this also happened, I think, around 2009, 2007. It was the early 2000s. 911 operators, guys, they hear all kinds of crazy crap. If you're going to be an operator in the 911 call center, you just have to be the kind of person that you can accept the fact that you're going to hear both horrific things and pleas for help and all kinds of strange things. Weird people just calling, that kind of thing. Well, Reno, Nevada, these 911 calls have the prize. As far as weirdness goes, this is top of the list. So let's talk about what happened. Like I said, early in the early 2000s, there was an elderly couple living in Reno, Nevada. And what happened is that the husband of this couple passed away. And his wife, dealing with grief and maybe a little bit of dementia, started making 911 calls asking for strange things like, can you adjust the thermostat? Can you get milk on your way home? Things like that. Can you pick this up from the store? And of course, the 911 operators, realizing they're dealing with an elderly person and that they're probably coping with dementia, were very patient. And they explained to her very gently that, this is 911 and that, you need to get a hold of your family and this, that, and the other. And she would, the lady seemed to understand through this gentle reminder that she's called 911, and she'd apologize and she'd get off the phone. And no, they never sent a responder. So they never sent police to her house or anything, because it was never it was really just kind of mundane. Like, I need you to do this, or I need you to bring home this from the store. It really was like, I need, make sure you fill up the car, Bob, talking to her husband sometimes, as if the 911 operator was her husband. But, it wasn't, obviously. It was 911. So, one night, though, the 911 operator, because they're getting used to this, and this has been going on for weeks and weeks and weeks, months even. This has been going on. And so they're getting very accustomed to seeing this lady's number and address pop up on their screen, because you know how it works. If you call 911, they're going to know who's calling them. That's how it works. And so they kind of got used to it, and it became really a routine thing. And they would, again, gently remind this lady that this is 911 and that she needed to call her family if she needed assistance. Well, one night, the phone rang and they saw that it was her number, and the 911 operator was prepared to do his due diligence again and just kind of remind the lady that this was 911 and not her husband who is deceased, and so on and so forth. So she picks up the phone, but the lady on the other side this time was very panicked, and she was asking for her husband to come and save her, that she was in danger, that she needed help, that there was somebody in her house, and that she sounded legitimately terrified. So the 911 operator at this point in time did dispatch first responders to her house. Police show up. They knock on the door. They can't get an answer at the door. They're, shining their flashlights in, and they're kind of curious as to what's going on. Nothing looks out of place from what they could see in the windows, but they're knocking. And then one of the guys goes around to the back of the house, and as he's knocking on the back door, it opens. And so he yells to his partner. He says, "The door's open back here," and he enters the home. He's, of course, calling out, police department, Reno, police department. He's announcing himself. And they enter the house. One of the things they noticed immediately is that the heat was off. And at night in the desert, guys, it gets really cold. And so the house itself was actually around 40 degrees, 45 degrees inside the house. It was pretty chilly in the house. And as they're making their way through the house and all the lights are off and they're just like, what the heck is going on? And they're calling to this lady, not getting any responses. They make their way upstairs. They enter the master bedroom, and there, laying on the bed, is this lady, and she is deceased. And not only is she deceased, she's been dead a while. In fact, rigor mortis has set in. I mean, she's stiff, guys. And but because the house was so cold and no heat had been on, her body was still fairly preserved. She really hadn't started breaking down and decaying, and it wasn't stinking or anything. So the police, of course, they call the coroner's office, and they all come in. They immediately say there's no foul play. They look, they check, they did an autopsy. She died of natural causes. And that was really strange. It was a really weird thing that this phone call happened in the first place, that they were like, oh man, that was kind of weird. But they just let it go, and that was the end of it. So they thought. Because later that week, the 911 operator gets a phone call. And when the 911 operator looks at the screen, it's from that house and from that woman's number. But it can't be, because this person now knows that person was deceased. I mean, This is the same operator that sent the police there in the first place, and they found the woman deceased. They answer the phone, and sure enough, on the other end of the line is this woman, and she's asking for help, and she's asking for her husband to come and save her, and that she needs help, and she sounds desperate. And the 911 operator is just like, okay, and very professional. They went through their whole procedure, because they have a procedure. Ma'am, can you give me this? Asking information. And no matter what they asked the woman or anything, she didn't respond to their questions. She just kept begging for help. And so they sent a first responder out to her house. And of course, there's nobody there. And they're just like, yeah, this is really strange. Guys, this went on for months, where they would receive calls at this 911 call center from this house, from this lady who is deceased. She is dead. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Even after, guys, her house was broken into, this old lady's house that was abandoned was actually broken into, and the person that broke into it started a fire that ended up burning the house to the ground. Okay? The phone calls kept coming into the 911 call center. Every time they'd pick up the phone, there was this old lady on the other end of the phone begging her husband to come and save her, that she was in danger and she was in desperate need of help. And the 911 operators are just flabbergasted. I mean, they're like, what is going on here? So they reached out to the phone companies, and they were like, hey, and they're even still sending police, guys. At this point in time, they're sending police out to this lady's property, and there's not even a house there anymore. It burnt to the ground, and the police officers would radio back to the call center and be like, look, there's not even a house here, guys. There's nothing going on here. But they don't have a choice, because they're receiving a phone call from some woman begging for help. They contacted the phone company and asked them about the line that's being used and this, that, and the other. Turns out the phone company had actually disconnected the line months before this. Like shortly after the lady was found deceased, they disconnected her phone line. For a year, guys, this lady would call clockwork to that call center asking for help. But after about a year of this happening, eventually the call stopped. And let me tell you, I don't know what to think about this one. I'd love to hear what you guys, what your opinion is on this. How could they possibly be receiving this call? How is this true? But it absolutely is. This is a crazy case of the paranormal for sure. But it gives me chills. I'm like, what? Could you imagine? Have you guys ever experienced anything paranormal? I'd love to hear it. Please leave that in the comment section below. But anyway, guys, that's it for King Piggly. These spooky tales. I really hope you've enjoyed these. More to come. Now that Halloween's almost over and past, guys, I'm going to do more real crime stories. I'm going to do more all kinds of stuff. Because again, it's something that really interests me. And I'm just going to kind of gear the channel to that. And if you enjoy this kind of stuff, please click that like button. Keep coming back and hanging out with me by subscribing. And don't forget to hit the bell, get the notifications so you don't miss out on the next dark, spooky, macabre, mysterious story that King Piggly, yours truly, brings to you guys. But that's it. King Piggly's out of here, and I will see you guys in the next video.